Lots of room. He's 40. Like a rocket. Look at Ginty go. Breaks a tackle. He's 20. He's 10. He's touchdown.
Here's a long run. Oklahoma State gonna do it again, and guess who? Big O to the house.
Milroe gonna run it again. Got a lane. Kicked in the turbo. Milroe. Goodbye. Touchdown, Bama.
Pump fake. Cook. End zone. Caught. Touchdown. Luther Burden the third.
This is the CFF Sites Week 8 College Fantasy Football Show. My name is Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF site, and a lot to get to this week. We're going to talk about that Alabama-Tennessee game, and I want to touch on that because I want to talk about and compare Jalen Milroe to a comment I made about Riley Leonard earlier in the year. We're going to talk about the Texas running back situation coming off that game against Georgia. A lot to get to this week. Talk about who I feel is in the Heisman running right now after 8 weeks of the season. But a lot to get to. And the one thing that I really want to mention, and I think it's really interesting off the top here, and that is there's a lot of names I have written down on the list in front of me. And one thing that I notice about a lot of names that I have here is that there are names of players who more than likely, unless you play in a really deep full FBS league, probably didn't get drafted. And so it just really proves my point that one of the many things that makes college fantasy football great is that you can completely swing and miss on a few high-profile players and still rebuild your roster and rebuild your roster to the point where you can have a championship roster in college fantasy football. And you'll see what I'm talking about. But there are a lot of names this week. When I mention the names, they were not on the draft day radar, but they are now, and for good reason. And so we'll get a lot of those. But, let's just start at the top, because the first name I'm going to throw out, Virginia Tech running back Bashil Tootin, 18 carries, 266 yards, 3 touchdowns against Boston College, even had a receiving TD. He's got 4 multiple TD games this year, TD in every game. And I throw out names like him and Mekhi Hughes, because those were some that we hit on in the preseason. It's nice when you get consistency from a running back that you invested early draft capital in. But you know what? Here's the thing, though. You got to call balls and strikes. For as many as we probably hit, we did miss quite a few. And this year seems like one of those years where there were a lot of heavy hitters that just didn't pan out, right? I mean, you've got Liberty quarterback Caden Salter. You got South Florida quarterback Byron Brown. The list goes on and on. Ollie Gordon at Oklahoma State, he teased us this past weekend. I'll talk about that a little bit. You've got Missouri wide receiver Luther Burden, who I think at this particular point really underperformed given where his preseason draft ranking was. So we're going to get into that. But I'll go over to Duke as well, because here's the thing with Jordan Moore. He started off the year, touchdown, 3 of his first 4 games. He doesn't have a touchdown in any of his last 3 games, and he's only got 7 receptions in his last 3. I would imagine there's a lot of you guys that are probably off of or have just recently moved off of Jordan Moore. Couldn't blame you. So there's some I'm going to tell you got to move on. There's some you got to hold. There's some you got to move off. If you moved off of Jordan Moore, I don't hate that move. BYU running back LJ Martin, what a fantastic finish in that BYU Oklahoma State game. He's got 6 touchdowns in 4 games played this year, 4 TDs in his 2 games played since he's come back from injury, and BYU with Iowa State looking like the 2 best teams in the Big 12 right now. I think some good games are ahead of you for you owners that have LJ Martin. And of course, BYU played Oklahoma State, and Ollie Gordon runs for 100 yards. Scores 3 touchdowns. 6 of his 7 touchdowns now have come in 2 games. So there's been absolutely no consistency. And I'm more curious to know if Ollie Gordon was on the bench for most lineups, and maybe even more so interested about what you do this week because Oklahoma State plays at Baylor. And I feel like you're in the boat that you have to roll the dice and start him if he's on your roster now. If you didn't play him last week, or if you did, great for you, great call. I didn't have the confidence in starting him last week, but I almost feel like if you have him, you have to roll the dice this weekend at Baylor. But look, I mean, he came off the field a couple of times, bumped up, bruised. And you just wonder, remember those preseason reports we were hearing about an injury? You wonder if any of those were true. I just think the problem really has been some offensive line, and Alan Bowman is not very good. I made this comment about Cam Rising, and I'll make it about Alan Bowman because I know he's been around for a little while, but I feel like when you're that old still playing college football, you're probably not that good. If you're older, there's only one guy that I think has played well into his mid-20s in college that was really good. Remember Chris Wenke from Florida State? But that's where after he did a stint playing minor league baseball and then came back to football and did his time in football. These guys have been in college football for like 12 years. Bowman just is not very good. And I just wonder it's a shame Rengel went down with an injury, but Bowman to me looks to me the reason why. And he's made some good throws this year. He's had some good games this year. He didn't look good against BYU. I know that for a fact. But let's talk about some under the radar quarterbacks, particularly you guys in full FBS leagues. Ben Woolridge, Louisiana, 4 TDs in 3 of his last 5 games, and he's accounted for 3 TDs in 4 of the last 5. You got Old Dominion quarterback Colton Joseph, ran for 111 yards in 3 TDs this past weekend. 2 weeks ago, he had 4 touchdowns. He accounted for 4 touchdowns in that game against Coastal Carolina. And so now you've got a couple of options right there if you're looking to rebuild your quarterback room, where you've got some Sun Belt quarterbacks that may be able to put up some decent numbers for you here down the stretch. And then let's just talk about Army quarterback Bryson Daly, which he's not available on any waiver wire. He's on a roster right now. But the thing that's interesting, 19 rushing touchdowns this year. He's got more rushing touchdowns than Ashton Jeanty for Boise State. He leads the FBS in rushing touchdowns, right? So you look at Daly, you look at Woolridge, you look at Colton Joseph. Just those names right there, and we're just starting off the show. 3 names that probably no one drafted at the beginning of the year that are now pretty decent fantasy options this year. Missouri wide receiver Luther Burden. He's gone 3 straight games without a receiving touchdown. I know he's had a rushing touchdown on a reverse. But when you think about where he was ranked at the beginning of the year, he's only got 4 receiving touchdowns in 7 games. He only has one 100-yard receiving game all year. And that Missouri offense just, I don't know. It looks like they used him more, took more shots with him downfield last year. They were more creative with him. It just doesn't feel that Missouri offense just looks like it's struggling. I don't know what it is. There was talk that Missouri could be a surprise team in the SEC. They just don't look very good to me. They look okay. They're competitive. But Luther Burden, from a fantasy perspective, very underwhelming this year, in my opinion. On the opposite end of that spectrum, Arizona State, Cam Scatterbo. I mentioned him last week. He had the 2 touchdowns against Utah, 2 more touchdowns this past weekend. He's got 2 rushing touchdowns in 4 of his last 5 games. I love that Arizona State offense, the way they feed the rock to a running back 1. I will be targeting Arizona State running back next year. Curious to see who the running back 1 will be there. And talk about running back heavy, Indiana, right? Curtis Rourke. I know he's going to be out this week, but I watched that first half against Nebraska. Curtis Rourke. There was concerns coming over from Ohio to Indiana. We referenced the non-conference schedule at the beginning of the year. That was going to be really good for Indiana. They have been so run heavy in the red zone that Justin Ellison and Tyson Lawton have been an unbelievable 1-2 punch. But when I look at the way that Curtis Rourke plays and I see what Indiana has, I look at their schedule. Indiana possibly could run the table and maybe lose 1 game at Ohio State. I think Indiana's good enough to beat Michigan. And I'm curious, if Indiana loses 1 game and it's on the road at Ohio State, what where that puts them, that's college football playoff position. Could we see the Hoosiers in the college football playoff if they only finish with one loss, maybe two, Big Ten championship game? We'll see. But Indiana has looked really impressive to me. I was worried about them as the competition has gotten a little stiffer, but man, they just steamrolled Nebraska. Oklahoma goes back to Jackson Arnold after giving Michael Hawkins a shot. And, I think the worst thing that happened for Michael Hawkins was Auburn gift wrapping a game to Oklahoma when Hawkins played at Auburn, because Peyton Thorne basically gift wrapped a game to Oklahoma, because had it not been for that careless interception, Auburn probably wins that game at home. But that interception really handed Oklahoma the win, and in my opinion, allowed Hawkins to stay at quarterback. But man, if you've watched him over the last couple of games, he just looks like he's over his skis. And I was glad to see Jackson Arnold get back in there. I think Arnold, I know I mentioned Seth Luttrell, I thought was going to be gone at the end of the season. Didn't even make it past week 8, he didn't even make it into week 9. They're already making a change. I do think that Oklahoma can still be competitive in the SEC with Jackson Arnold at quarterback if they can play a little bit more conservatively, because I feel that defense is pretty good, but they're not going to score 30 points a game. They're just not going to. And they're going to have to find a way to do it now with a new offensive coordinator, somebody new calling plays. But I do think that Oklahoma is just a better team with Jackson Arnold. They'll at least, I feel, be a little bit more competitive and not worry about turning the ball over to the opposing team. But South Carolina took them behind the woodshed this past weekend and really, in my opinion, kind of exposed Michael Hawkins and his inexperience. UAB, under the radar plays. I mentioned Wooldridge from Louisiana, Colton Joseph, Old Dominion. What about UAB wide receiver Amari Thomas? UAB has really struggled this year. He's got a TD in 4 of his last 5 games. I think it's worth putting him on your radar, as it is tight end Blake Bozma from Western Michigan. He had 3 TDs this past week versus Buffalo. He's got at least 1 receiving touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games. He's an under a radar play I think you got to look for in most leagues if he's available on your waiver wire. But let's go to the running back position, because you got Jaden Nixon and you had Jalen Buckley. And last week's show, I said, you know what? Looks like we got a split backfield. If I had to put my money on one player, it would be Jalen Buckley. And now all of a sudden, fast forward in 1 week, and it's Nixon, who had 14 carries, 112 yards, 3 TDs. 3 weeks ago, 14 carries, 124 yards, 3 TDs. Jalen Buckley still had 13 rush attempts this past week, only 56 yards. And I feel like if you're going to get a really big game and an average game and a big game and an average game, that makes Jaden Nixon worth starting. So I have completely flipped again this week, and I'm back on the Jaden Nixon train. And I would be starting him if I had him. South Florida, Byron Brown, man, I've been saying for the last 3 or 4 weeks, this was the part of the schedule you really wanted Byron Brown. And not only is he injured, he may miss multiple games. This is where desperation comes in for some of you guys. I think if you have Byron Brown and you're in a good spot with your team because you have a lot of depth, you can afford to keep him. If you're really desperate right now, I'd suggest dangling him out there as trade bait. And you might have to do it to a team that's doing pretty good but have some good depth. Because if you need to win now, you're going to have to risk giving up Byron Brown and that end of the season schedule for instant production. So here's one of those players where if you're sitting pretty good, maybe you scoop up Byron Brown on the cheap. And if you're doing really well and have him, you hold him. Or if you're not doing well and you have him, you try to make him attractive for a playoff run for some team and try to scoop up some players that you need now. But for me, that's what Byron Brown is right now. Some sort of trade bait, or you're holding him right now and hoping that you can kind of get some riches here over the last month of the season if in fact he's able to come back. Washington State, quarterback John Mateer, 5-touchdown performance against Hawaii, but I still say the wide receiver situation is too risky for me. Too volatile, too unpredictable. I don't want anyone in that Washington State offense but John Mateer, unless you're in a deep, deep FBS league. Navy quarterback Blake Horvath, Army Bryce Daly. I mean, Blake Horvath If he passes for 112 yards this weekend against Notre Dame, we'll have 1,000 yards passing in 7 games for a Navy quarterback. He has 10 rushing touchdowns right now and 10 passing TDs. Those two guys absolutely lights out. Horvath and Daly right now, undoubtedly just outplaying many of the quarterbacks we even had ranked in the top 20 in the preseason. Both of them right now fantasy studs. Of course, Navy gets Notre Dame this weekend. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Baylor quarterback Sawyer Robertson, 3 passing touchdowns in 3 straight games. Again, another player that was really not on the draft radar at the beginning of the year with Daquan Finn, who had transferred in there. Utah State running back Rashul Faison. Again, a lot of attention on the Utah State passing game and Jalen Royals. And he's ripped off 4 straight TD in 4 straight games. It looks really good and a solid fantasy running back option. Rashul Faison at Utah State. Let's go to Texas Tech, because an interesting statistic for me is that Taj Brooks through 12 games had 268 rush attempts last year. And I think there was a moment, maybe in the beginning of the season, where Mike and I did our preseason show, and we felt that we did not think that Brooks would get that type of volume again in a second consecutive season, because with Kitley at the helm of the offense, you would think, Baron Morton coming back, that they would be a little bit more pass heavy and transition and run the ball a little less. Well, let me tell you what's happened. Through 6 games, because remember, Brooks has missed 1 game this year. But in his 6 games played this year, he's averaged more rush attempts per game than he did last year when he had 268 rush attempts in 12 games. They're continuing to ride Taj Brooks. I love high volume guys. Good for you fantasy owners that have them. This past week, going into the week, I think there were 2 players who had at least 32 receptions and not 1 single touchdown reception. Caden Robinson from Appalachian State was the player with the most receptions without a touchdown. But the player with the second most receptions without a touchdown was Andrew Armstrong, wide receiver, Arkansas. He had a touchdown this past week against LSU. Why do I mention that? Maybe it's Robinson's turn this week for Appalachian State, who had a bye last week. Florida. Let's go to Florida, because Jaden Baugh had 5 touchdowns in that win against Kentucky. But I warn anyone that goes after him on the waiver wire, because I think you're really, in my opinion, maybe missing a chance to pick up another really good player if you have a good priority waiver wire position. Because if you get Jaden Baugh, I believe Florida has a bye this week coming, and then they play Georgia. So yeah, you take the chance on picking up a running back. We'll see what happens with Montrell Johnson. And of course, Baugh just had 5 touchdowns in that win against Kentucky. So they're probably going to use him moving forward. But you may not get anything out of him for the next 2 weeks with a bye and a matchup against Georgia. I think you're better off passing on a guy like Baugh and letting the competition use their priority waiver position and go after another player that can pay some instant dividends, at least over the next couple of weeks for you. TCU, wide receiver Savion Williams. Not sure many people stayed up late to watch that Utah TCU game. Low scoring game, but Savion Williams was their leading rusher, and they're using him out of that wild frog formation. And I'm just curious. I think you have to start him moving forward if they're going to use him in that capacity, or even if they just give him, I think he had 7 rush attempts. Even if he gets 4 rush attempts, I think using him in that capacity, he's a must start in the next game. I just want to touch on Memphis, because I think I mentioned this last week, and I know I mentioned it in one of my notes and observations over the last couple of weeks. But, for me, I'm just surprised that Seth Hennigan, quarterback Memphis, only has 10 passing touchdowns. But Memphis has 20 rushing touchdowns as a team, 2-to-1 running touchdown to passing touchdown ratio. That's a great thing if you have running back Mario Anderson. Let's go to Texas, because I mentioned this on last week's show. I said there was a real-time span of 5 minutes where, for me, told me everything I needed to know about the Texas running back situation. And that was when Wisner broke a run against Oklahoma, fumbled it into the end zone. Silas Bolden recovered it for a touchdown. Oklahoma gets the ball back, turnover. Texas, very next play, first touch. No, they leave Wisner in the game, even with his fumble around the goal line. He takes it to the house, touchdown Texas. And for me, that was the defining moment that I said, Wisner's the running back one here. Well, in that game against Georgia, the biggest opponent they're probably going to play all year until they get to the playoffs, Trey Wisner, 15 rush attempts. Jaden Blue, 0. But here's the funny thing. Jaden Blue had a better fantasy game because he had 7 receptions, 48 yards receiving, and a touchdown. Wisner caught 5 passes for 11 yards. Jaden Blue was actually the better fantasy player in the game against Georgia. But for me, when I look at the numbers, I'd much rather have Wisner. 15 rush attempts to 0 against Georgia. Man, I could really see him having the breakout game against Vanderbilt this weekend. I'm curious to see how that unfolds, but I think Wisner could have a big game this week. And then let's talk about the Alabama-Tennessee game, but I want to talk about Notre Dame quarterback Riley Leonard first. If you remember in the preseason, I think I had mentioned on some preseason shows that we were doing, I really liked the Riley Leonard, Will Howard stack that I was getting and the value in which I was getting them in like rounds 4, 5, or 5 and 6, 6 and 7, back to back. But I want to reference earlier in the year when Notre Dame lost to Northern Illinois. If you go back and listen to the show that I recorded that week following that loss, I said with Notre Dame's schedule, they probably could not afford another loss. And I feel that they really needed to utilize Riley Leonard as a runner. That was his strength, more so than a passer, particularly given Notre Dame's wide receiver situation. Well, he has scored, a touchdown, rushing touchdown in 7 straight games, 10 rushing touchdowns in his last 6. They've unleashed him on the ground, and Notre Dame has looked much better, and they have a really good ground game. They're taking advantage of that, and that's who they have become this year. The reason I mention that is because watching that Alabama-Tennessee game, when you look at quarterback Jalen Milroe, in my opinion, he's not Michael Penix. He's not. And why they're keeping him in the pocket so much throwing the ball is beyond me. But now that Alabama is in the position that they are with 2 losses, I still feel Bama can make the playoffs if they run the table. But I don't think they can run the table until they make a philosophical change in the way they call plays, in the way DeBoer runs that offense. They need to utilize Milroe more in design runs and lean on the running game. That running game is, I think, pretty good for Alabama. Because the passing game, you've got Jeremy Bernard, you've got Ryan Williams. I can only imagine where they'd be without Ryan Williams right now. Imagine if he doesn't make that catch against Georgia. I'd be even concerned. Alabama could be done right now. But to me, it's the system that they're trying to have Milroe run. He's not a pocket passer. He's not even close to a pocket passer. They have to get him on the edge. They have to utilize him in the run game. They have to use the backs more. They have to do very similar. They have to do a similar thing that Notre Dame did after they lost to Northern Illinois. They need to go all in with Jalen Milroe as more of a true dual threat quarterback as opposed to using him as a pocket passer. We'll see what happens moving forward. I still like Milroe as a great fantasy option, but if they use him more in the run game, I feel like he could be really, really good, both statistically. I mean, look what John Mateer is doing at Washington State, and he's not that great of a passer. Utilize Milroe more in the running game, use the backs, get them involved more. We'll see what happens. And on the Tennessee side, I do think I want to give some credit where credit's due because I've been very critical, or not very critical, but I just look at Nico, and I said this a couple of weeks ago. I just don't think he's as good as what many thought. And that's maybe just going into this year. Maybe we're just 1 year too soon on Nico. But I will say this, and I will give him credit. He made a couple of really big, nice throws in that Alabama game. And Milroe just looked like trash in the pocket and couldn't hit a receiver. And in my opinion, The difference in that game was the ability of Nico being able to make a couple of crucial throws in that game. To me, Nico and his ability to just hit a couple of those was the difference in that Tennessee-Alabama game. So I've been critical of Nico all year. I still don't think he's a good fantasy option. Matter of fact, I know he's not. But you got to give credit where credit's due. He made a couple of big throws in big moments that I feel was the difference in that game. And talk about big throws, talk about big moments, talk about big games. Let's go to the Heisman Trophy. I feel like it's Cam Ward and Ashton Genty 1-2, and it's their show. Travis Hunter's fallen off. Jalen Milroe's fallen off. I felt like a couple of weeks. Well, Howard was a dark horse. If he goes down and they call that down with 1 second and they kick a field goal, maybe he's still in it. Is Dylan Gabriel a dark horse? I just think with the way Miami's giving up points, the way Ward's putting up numbers, it's going to be hard right now to not see him holding up that Heisman Trophy at the end of the year with the numbers that he's putting up for the team he's playing for. He's a quarterback. The games are always on TV at good times for people to watch. Ashton Genty, he would have to go absolutely lights out, continue pinball numbers. They are playing on the West Coast, not as many eyes on him, so he needs eyes on his numbers more so than his games, because his numbers just have to look stupid for him to really, I think, beat out Cam Ward right now for the Heisman. But in my opinion, Cam Ward is the player to beat for the Heisman Trophy. So that's going to do it for the Week 8 show. A lot. But like I also mentioned, when you look now, we're 8 weeks into the season, and you look at all the names that I threw out off of this list, many of them weren't on rosters at the beginning of the year. Just speaks to the power of the college fantasy football waiver wire and targeting the right guys as they become available. So look, we're going down the home stretch. The playoffs, college fantasy football playoffs are almost here. Week 9 is upon us. So it's going to do it for the Week 8 show. My name is Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF site. Good luck to everybody in Week 9. See you in Week 10.